Okay, so you've got a big buffet there.
I mean, and take them however you like.
Yep,
Right?
exactly.
Just, some might kind of coalesce into others. So.
Sure. Let me go with number 4 first because that's the easiest one. There's the ability to apply for a flexible schedule, to do it at different hours. My administrative person did 7:30 to 4 o'clock with a half-hour lunch. She has 7 children. But it always has to be, It always has to be approved by a supervisor, as did the idea of having fewer hours. Truly, that was just approved by the supervisor, and that was denied a number of women who asked to do 32 hours rather than 40 hours a week. So, housing. Housing, yes, it is. It's the thing holding back our economy. And again, the economics nerd in me can really go back to the dot-com bubble, which popped, and Alan Greenspan and other Federal Reserve policymakers. And I sat there and watched all these press conferences, so there's a lot here. But they basically stomped down interest rates to make money cheap because they didn't want the economy to go into recession after the dot-com bubble burst. To some extent, that created a mortgage bubble because money was so cheap, and you end up with shows like Flip This House. I mean, when you end up with like 6 different shows about flipping houses on cable TV, chances are you're in a bubble. And so then that bubble popped around about 2008. There were a lot of factors in it, and we've been pushing everyone into home ownership. So we are close to a decade since then. And there was obviously, I don't know if anybody's read The Big Short. It's an excellent book. It's also an excellent movie. But some weird financial mechanisms that got into making selling mortgages more profitable in ways that didn't even make sense. So the bubble was made worse by Wall Street and no oversight on financial things that didn't make sense on Wall Street. And we're a decade from that, and nothing's been built. So I've been hearing increasingly people talking about a lost decade in our economy. And I don't know about that. I would say it's more of a decade where housing got weird because we stopped building things, but we didn't think about what we needed. And given that we've been pushing everybody into home ownership, that we were out of rentals. There are no rentals. And of course, people can always rent their homes. In Santa Fe, we've seen that. We've seen very little building for the better part of a decade. And we've seen continued popularity as a second home destination. And for those of us that own property, it's been okay because I have more wealth in my property and more equity in my mortgage because a rising tide has lifted the value that I have. So there is wealth that has been returned to people in Santa Fe by this second home market, but we are at a crisis because we can't house workers who often need rental places, and to decide whether they want to stay, they're not going to buy a home. And we, with the pent-up demand, barely have anything anybody can afford on a reasonable salary. So the gap has gotten wider, and it's generated some wealth here locally, but it's also really at an unsustainable place. And if we don't address it now, I think, frankly, we become a place where we have wealthy people and service sector workers who commute in to do service sector jobs, and that is truly why I want to be mayor, to make sure that doesn't happen, because I want this to be a vital place. So what I want to do around housing, there's an acronym, because we need multi-pronged solutions. We need many of them. There is no one silver bullet, and it starts with a big vision that is to simply address the housing crisis. We all agree on that, and so let's start there. And we need a city-wide strategy to address the housing crisis. Specifically, I call it BILD, build, which is we need to bond for infrastructure that gets sewer trunk lines in places that would get us to phase 3 of Tierra Contenta. There's a sewer trunk line missing, and it's been really tough to get that money. There is actually money allocated. It's unclear whether it's enough, but to build a sewer trunk line to do that, and there's other infrastructure that could be bonded for that the city owns. It's related to I, which is incentivize desirable types of buildings, so particularly in infill areas where perhaps we can put up some housing, whether it's what's known as multifamily, which is also apartments, or tiny houses, or sort of duplexes. There's a lot of different models, and people can build cool things all the time, but where we can put housing, we can incentivize with things like sidewalks and street improvements so that neighbors get a benefit of something like added traffic, because neighbors always say traffic, NIMBYism is about basically traffic, parking, and crime. Always, not just here, everywhere. And so it's really common, but we have to address those things. But we need to bond, we need to incentivize, we need land donations for tax credit projects. And in particular, I think the schools and the city need to work together to have land that is publicly owned so that we start getting teed up for tax credit projects every year. And this is HUD, which is a federal office, Housing and Urban Development, has affordability guidelines for very often the low end of the income spectrum that make affordable housing, and is backed up by tax credits that are federal tax credits. So there's one going on. My friend Daniel Werwoff is the developer of the Arts and Creativity Center on Siler. The city's allocated 5 acres to build a bunch of units there, and we need more of those coming on. And for the schools, we can do it for teachers, and maybe teachers can have subsidized rents until they get to the next tier of pay. Or at least for the first few years, so we can stick them in the community, because I think we're reaching a real crisis point on teachers. So, bond, incentivize, get land donations, and D is increased density. In Portland, they're doing very good stuff around accessory dwelling units. In Santa Fe, we might call them casitas. But, we should... and maybe even incentivize people putting in smaller homes on their property where there's room, and having a casita, because that is the fastest, most equitable way to get housing throughout the city, is to put smaller places on existing lots. And that can also add wealth to people that own properties, and even make it possible sometimes for people who are having trouble making their mortgage payment. I mean, we have a guest house on my property, and it is part of why I can run for mayor, because that is paying enough of our mortgage that we are not in dire straits where I have to go out and be bringing home an hourly wage every day because of that casita. And so I think we need to have that multi-pronged strategy, and we need to work on all the things, and there needs to be buy-in across the city, because if we keep bringing forward one project at a time, NIMBYism will kill it every time. We have to have a bigger vision. Unions. I love unions, and I have been trying to understand how unions evolve for 20 plus years. I used to cover the UAW negotiations with the Detroit automakers as a BBC journalist. I have been talking to, actually the deputy director of Youth Works at the time, took me to a blue-green conference before Van Jones was as big a deal as he is now, but he was a speaker at this Blue-Green Alliance, which was environmentalism and unions coming together to talk about things. I think unions need to evolve and need to add value. I talked to somebody recently who said about the city union, the executive has rarely understood the usefulness of having one negotiating entity at the table. And that turned on a really important light bulb for me, because I really want to evolve how the city's workforce functions, and even the role it plays in our local economy and what it does for local people. And having one entity to talk to about that can be really, really useful. So, I think unions are just so important for the simple, again, when you strip things bare, it's like, what's the point of public banking? It's to keep the profits from banking in the community. What's the point of unions? It's to counterbalance the bosses, the executive control. And I think we need that more than ever. And unions exist as a robust structure, and it's imperative right now that we keep and have unions. But that unions can be better if they evolve and really work on what is the value proposition in the modern economy of a collaborative of workers. Forest management. So I love the Verde Fund model. That's training. Who asked about forest management? Okay, that was you. I love the Verde Fund model that's training kids to pull out some of the detritus and using that labor force. Truly that's something I don't know a huge amount about. I know we have biomass, and that I've listened to the firefighters over the years saying it's not if but when. We have a giant fire in Santa Fe, so I think we need to work on fire prevention. But forest management is something that I think we need to talk to experts and work on, really managing our watershed. That's the big deal from the city government perspective, is how secure is that watershed. And I think I was just talking to actually an urban forester, and that was a kind of an interesting conversation the other night. And I thought, okay, we should think about urban forestry in the city of Santa Fe, because we water a lot of trees in this basin that is where Santa Fe has its thing. And I'm wary of the model where a politician knows everything or a leader knows everything. I am a journalist at my core, and I think you need to understand from the experts. And so I'm very big on asking people who know. And forest management is sort of one of those things that I would say, thinking about it as a community and asking people who know and looking for best practices in understanding to balance ecology and things like our watershed and the risk of fire and that sort of thing.
Could I just follow up with one more? If, the big question is whether fuels would be reduced around people's homes to protect their home, or whether that activity happens in roadless areas and remote parts of the national forest. So it's really not, there's very good science to say if you take fuels down around the home, you're going to prevent that home from burning down. So that's really the question. Do you have a view on that?
Well, that's what the Verde Fund is doing. It's actually looking to train young people to clear the fuel around people's homes to prevent the homes from burning. And I think that's a great model, partly because, some of it is just for young people who have a lot of physical energy. It's very physically demanding work. And I think that intuitively makes sense to me to do it around people's homes and make sure we have breaks, so that if a forest fire started, what is the path, and do you have a break where it would have trouble jumping and getting into residential areas and that sort of thing, because California was horrible to watch this fall, really horrible. Okay, I answered 4, city government, existing childcare stuff. The Entrada protest and free speech zone. So again, I think fundamentally what the city needs to look at what it controls, and what it controls is the police department. And the police handled that really, really badly. This free speech zone is nonsense. I cannot even believe anybody thought that would be okay. Because it's not. And there should have been, in my view, an explicit instruction to the police on the ground to have a great deal of tolerance for that protest, not to end up charging a woman whom nobody could visibly see doing much wrong with 2 felonies. How does that happen? Because there should have explicitly been a bias to hey, let's be sensitive. People are upset. There are going to be, and I get that they talked themselves into, and if you saw the, I'm sure you did, Craig, because I know you read these things, but if you saw the emails that came out through one of the journalists' IPRA requests about how the police had worked themselves into this, oh my gosh, this is going to be an out-of-control protest. On some level, I get it, but I really would have hoped that there would be more rational minds, calm minds prevailing, going, this is Santa Fe. It's honestly hard to get anybody to show up to anything. How big is this going to be? And unless We are looking at, I mean, I don't even know, I can't even get my head around at what scale would the police have needed a free speech zone and the response that they had in that sort of extreme level. And I try to understand through reading those emails that they work themselves up and to give them the benefit of the doubt. But it needs not to happen. We need to have a really, truly, and I feel like a lot of people say community policing, but what community policing is to me is knowledge of the community. We need to encourage cops to understand who the criminals are, who the natural, I met with a woman recently who was documenting all of the needles she finds, all of the cars she sees. She knows who every drug dealer is in her community, and they need to use her as a resource. And I'm sorry that she doesn't sleep, that she instead documents this stuff, but she has a lot of valuable information. She's very evidence-based. And community policing is finding, is finding that person in a neighborhood. There's one on my street, which is Ephraim Street, which is ground zero for drug dealers. And you know what? Chuck across the street has got cameras. He keeps an eye on the rap sheet, and always, I can't read it, but again, we all do our part, and Chuck knows who's been arrested with an address on Ephraim Street all the time. And so community policing is making sure we have a culture where the cops are encouraged to really have that block-by-block knowledge, that neighborhood knowledge to access. This is still small enough a town to do that. And on the Entrada specifically, the city's role can be to convene a conversation around it, because it is so clear we need to talk about it. And we need to invite people in, and I like the model here, but we need to, which, would give voices that have been traditionally less heard a higher spot in line. And I think, there's a lot that can be done around that, because tempers are high and we need to talk.
So the question I really want to ask is, not only does the city council have control over the police, city council has control over the
permits.
City land that the taxpayers own. Mm-hmm. And so will you support or insist that La Entrada move to private property and get off of the city land and keep the taxpayers from having to subsidize something that's clearly objectionable?
It's clearly objectionable, and the city has control over the permit, because that's the mechanism by which the public land is controlled. And another thing is reading about it the next day when the city's public information officer said we considered this private. It was just like, no, you don't get to do that. They had a permit to use public land, but truly, I want to have a conversation. I'm not willing to go there because I have talked to folks for whom the Entrada is part of Fiesta, and Fiesta is a larger cultural thing that includes, I talked to the guy who was fixing my alarm because I live on Ephraim Street, and there's a lot of users there. Anyway, it makes me sleep well. And he was talking about the mentorship he did for young men, and really helping them to become community citizens and to stand up and represent a proud Spanish heritage and all of these things. And I really heard him, and I heard the importance of that cultural foundation. Now, there's a great deal about the Entrada that is offensive, objectionable, and even encouraged by the extra layer of Anglo folks interested in costume pageantry once upon a time, when that was all the rage to get in tourism. So, I don't know the answer, but I know we need to talk about it, and that we need to look at the permits, and in particular, the police and what they charge for what, because it's not equal. For 8 major events and for other things. And that's another thing the city controls, is like, are we subsidizing by giving a break to certain entities that do public events and need a police presence, and certain ones that don't. So I think we need to talk about the Entrada specifically. We need to look at how the permitting's done, and we need community policing fundamentally, which was, I'm going into that question because I think I've answered a lot of it. And the other part of the question was, What will I do when and if the police shoot someone? Eek. Honestly, I don't know. That is just, I mean, it happened when I was in high school. I think the police shot a kid, and and then there were a couple kids who shot each other, and gun violence is something that we need to get to grips with in America. I don't truly know how I react to that with someone on the local police force. I do know I like the guns to garden tools. I would like to see us not have to allow firearms into the city council meetings, but that's protected by state law. So that we need to lobby at our state that we have better gun control. We need to close the gun show loophole, because it's just fundamentally crazy that we make it so easy to get guns. And we need to, I mean, it's like driving a car. We have a good system for licensure around driving a car. Why can't we do the same with weapons? But I think, and your question was more specifically about police, that again, it sort of goes to the community policing model, and that the training needs to become biased towards don't shoot. Don't ever shoot. Unless there are extreme circumstances that might warrant it. And I would like to see that bias particularly be a part of the training of the Santa Fe Police Department, because I think we have an opportunity to bring back community policing. And again, to go into the larger trends, September 11th happened. I live in New York at the time. I remember being here, I think at the holidays, just after that, and being in a friend's home, and President Bush, George W. Bush, did a big speech addressing a joint session of Congress, and he created the Department of Homeland Security. And I'm a little bit of a nerd, a little bit of a government nerd. And I remember going around that holiday party and saying, he just created a new cabinet-level department. Is anybody freaked out about this? He just created a new cabinet-level department. And nobody would talk to me about that night. But this many years later, and because I was able to do some work in Mayor Koss's administration that documented grant funding to the police department, I have an understanding of what happened, which is we militarized our police department. After September 11th, we created the Department of Homeland Security, and then we started grant funding to police departments, things like tanks and things for urban warfare, because we became obsessed with terrorism. And we actually, even without saying the values of our police forces are changing, we did it through the stuff we gave them. And we forgot how community policing works. And truly, it might have been better to say, no, we don't need a tank in Santa Fe. A Jeep will do just fine for whatever we need, I'm sure. So I'd really like to see us lead the way, even nationally, in returning to a model where there's community policing and a bias against shooting people. Was there I think I'm supposed to go through. There's a question back there. I don't know, follow up.
I think we should be clear that it was nothing to do with terrorism. The Patriot Act, Department of Homeland Security, was all stuff that the Republican and the right wing and the super rich had on their wish list already and tried to get past piecemeal. It's all about them recognizing as they get more and more of the wealth, they're going to need a stronger force between them and the rest of the people. And that's what the police are, is the citadel to protect the super rich against those who are have-nots.
Yeah.
Do we want that here? That should be,
Yeah. I hope you're wrong. Very often I actually don't buy government conspiracies because I've worked in government and it's not that organized a lot of the time.
No, it's systematic.
But yeah.
It's widespread. It's all out in the open.
Yeah.
Did you get to public broadband? I forget.
No, I haven't gotten to public broadband or property taxes.
Oh,
and they're,
okay.
I think,
Exciting.
property taxes. By and large, we have a disproportionately GRT funded system. We fund 80 to 85% of our government on GRT, and that's probably not the right way around.
Taxes.
Yes, sorry, gross receipts taxes, sales tax, what you pay on a purchase in a retail establishment. And we should really move to a more equitable property tax thing. I do not think there's appetite for that right now. I just, there have been some decent policy proposals put forward in the past, and they have been really rejected. And so here's my favorite quote from one of them, from Mayor David Koss. I don't tell the council what to do, and this was when he was mayor. The people need to tell the council what to do. So if there were a groundswell ready to really work for a property tax increase and creating some more equitable taxation systems, hallelujah. I think we need to look at that in our revenue possibilities as part of the budgeting process at the city. There will be a new mayor, whom I believe will be me, in March, we hope, unless they screw up this ranked choice voting thing so badly that we end up in some, anyway, we won't go down that road. The budget needs to be passed by about the end of May. So there's a very tight turnaround to a new city budget. There will be a new mayor and 3 new city councilors. This is an opportunity to really understand our revenues and our expenditures. It's not an infinitely complex system. We get money from a certain number of places and we spend money on a certain number of things. There are 18 departments. I'm a financial reporter at my core. I want this to be clear and understood. We used to do Federal Reserve policy in 30 seconds or less. I believe that the city budget is understandable to 9 members of the governing body and the larger community that hopefully, in a broad way, chooses to pay attention. So I think we need to do that. I think we need to reset and we need to understand. And if we have increments of property tax available, we should look at that. Right now, honestly, we're where we always get to, and it's tough, but GRT has picked up because we had a good tourism year in 2017. So there's more money than expected. And that is not generally a time that we raise taxes. And I do think there's a lot of efficiency to be found in city government and an evolution of the functions of what it does and understanding the expenditure. Public broadband is maybe my favorite topic. And I have trouble being brief about my favorite topics. So if there's appetite, I can keep talking. But public broadband, like the P&M thing, there was an assessment done, and it was hugely expensive to build an underground fiber to the premise network. Hugely expensive. The answer ultimately is I don't want to see the city become an internet service provider. I don't think we'd be good at it. And a lot of that is telling people when they say my internet's not working, okay, is your router plugged in? Maybe turn it off and on again. I don't think that that's what the city government should be doing. We need retail internet service providers. What we did, and I had the great privilege of overseeing the absolutely brilliant work of Sean Moody, our broadband project manager. He was then fired on a technicality and didn't work for a year, but now he's back. But honestly, I sort of think we wouldn't be at the crisis that we're at if Sean had not, if we'd had a government that could do the right thing. And, you know, actually having him let go and being unable to get him back was part of the reason I left the city a little over a year ago, because there's this litmus test of can you get done what needs to be done. Anyway, and so I decided I was going to move on to other things because that was really important and I couldn't get him back. But he's back now at 3 times the rate, but he's worth every penny of it, and he is working on broadband. And the solution is, and I listen deeply to the city's broadband expert on what to do, and the solution is to compel our overhead carriers, so they have broadband on lines, poles. And we can compel our overhead carriers through franchise agreements to cover the city in broadband, in cables. Now that's Comcast and CenturyLink. So it is empowering those two and compelling them to be better. But it's not digging, which is incredibly expensive and complicated because you'll always hit something. And we did when we broke CenturyLink's monopoly with phase 1 of broadband. And we created a redundant line from the old phone company on East Alameda where the copper wires go out from, and that's a lot of retail service, actually goes out over those copper wires. So we created a trunk line from that phone company to the Sims building on Cordova, where all of the other big cables come up from Albuquerque. And so now everything's connected, and we created the conditions where any provider can come in and get turnkey service. They don't have to talk to CenturyLink to get to that phone company anymore. They can talk to the city through CyberMesa, who's the city's provider, and the city controls the terms by which that wholesale, what's called long backhaul, it's the long distance backhaul, because everybody, when you're on your phone, that information has to go somewhere and get connected somehow, and this is what we know is durable, the big backhaul cables. So there are a number of solutions, and what we should do is the city can own the infrastructure that is those big cables, but most immediately we can compel our incumbent carriers to build broadband to every corner of the city by hanging it on their overhead poles. And if we are continuing to look for wholesale market solutions where the city owns and allows others to basically lease the fiber, it's like we're the owner, they lease it and provide internet service, we should look at the smart solutions to that. And one of those is sort of what I alluded to earlier, the film industry going probably from the College of Santa Fe campus to Santa Monica and having big processors on either ends of these cables so that we can really work on CGI and post-production for the film industry. So I think the long and the short of it is, I know it gets complicated, but that we need a hybrid solution. There can be publicly owned infrastructure and the use of publicly owned resources like the right-of-way, which is what the poles are, to compel and create the conditions for private businesses to work better for our broadband needs.
Can I follow up on that? So we can make a follow-up question. With net neutrality being overturned, what is in that hybrid that you're discussing? Would the city have any ability to stop Comcast or CenturyLink from doing some of the potentially terrible things that they could do?
I don't know. We'd have to look into what could be possible at the city level. Right now, there are state efforts that are good. Our Attorney General, I believe, has signed on to sue. And Howie Morales, who is running for lieutenant governor and is out of Silver City, has introduced legislation that would make it illegal in New Mexico, or that would ensure net neutrality in New Mexico. And as many things are sometimes the case, understanding the scale and where you need to play, and that is a better statewide thing, I think, than city. I don't know if we could and what we could do at the city level. Mm-hmm.
All right. So first of all, thank you, Kate, for giving us so much information.
Thank you very much.